On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the imprisonment of 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry into concentration camps.
Hi, folks. As you get settled, we're just setting the scene a little bit for our talk today.
There was no due process of law. The Japanese Americans were labeled a threat to national security and stripped of their constitutional rights. Decades of deep anti-Japanese and anti-Asian prejudice had resulted in 600 anti-Asian laws. Agribusiness and other profiteers made huge sums of money by taking advantage of the mass incarceration. They could take only what they could carry. Jobs, farms, businesses, and education were shattered, many never to be restored. The Constitution and its vaunted guarantees became a worthless scrap of paper in the face of horse stall barracks, barbed wire, and armed guards.
All right, folks, welcome. Today, we're going to get started now. Thanks so much for being on time with us this morning and for sharing your Friday morning with us. Hopefully, we'll get the slide up. Hi, welcome back if we saw you in February, and welcome for the first time if this is your first time joining us for part 2 of our series, Remembrance, Redress, and Reparation, Learning from the Past. I'm Sam. I'm the Interim Director of Public Programs and Education over at Japanese American Historical Society of San Diego. And I'm going to get us started this morning, first and foremost with our land acknowledgement. So go ahead and read along with me if you choose, or just listen in. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. The Japanese American Historical Society of San Diego acknowledges this legacy of balance and harmony, and we extend our gratitude and respect to the Indigenous peoples for their past and continued care and stewardship. Thank you. Okay. And also just to remind you folks who's joining us today. So we are the Japanese American Historical Society of San Diego. We are joined by the Asian Pacific Alliance in Higher Education at Palomar College. We are made possible, this program is made possible in the series by the California Humanities. So please do take a look at the website and look at all the wonderful things that they make possible, including this program. And at the end of today's program, you'll receive an email directly from Zoom, and it will contain a link to our survey. This is really important for our grant reporting, for our funding, to report to Cal Humanities about who's coming, what they thought of it, and all of those goodies. So it takes about 5 minutes. It's really quick. It's confidential. And it's pretty easy to do, but you will need the grant ID, which is here. I'm going to include that in your email, but just be aware that you're going to need this big long number. So hang on to that email when you click over to the survey link, and I'll include this in the chat at the end of the talk as well. But be prepared for that survey, please. That will help us out a lot. And just a couple more housekeeping things before we get started with folks. A few reminders. Please do ask questions. We'll have some time at the end of everybody's speaking parts today for questions. So use that Q&A function as things occur to you. Pop it into that Q&A. If it's a simple question, you might get a typed answer back from me while people are still talking. But if it's something about the content or something like that, we'll hold it to the end and get to as many as we can. So please do use that Q&A function. If you just want to say hi or share a connection or a story, please do so. Please put that in the chat so we can all see it, and make sure those questions get into the Q&A so we don't miss them in the chat. And also for today, if you need subtitles or transcription, please do use the closed caption function that's available to you. It should be at the bottom of your screen, kind of towards the right, and it will bring up those captions as people are talking. be forewarned that sometimes the names and dates and some specific terms might be a little misspelled or a little funny, but it is taking live transcription. So if you need that, please do use that function. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Kay Ochi, who's the president of Japanese American Historical Society of San Diego, and she will introduce our speakers today.
Good morning, and thank you, Sam. This is Samantha Alberts, who is our Director of Programs and Education at the Japanese American Historical Society, and she is our tech guru, so I do thank Samantha. And on behalf of the Japanese American Historical Society of San Diego and the Palomar College, APAHI program, we welcome you to today's program entitled Japanese Americans, World War II, and the Fight for Justice. I am the current president of the JAHSSD. I'm a Sansei, that means a third generation Japanese American, and I'm a native San Diegan. I did spend 35 years teaching in Los Angeles, but returned to San Diego in my retirement. And most importantly, my mom and dad, along with almost 2,000 other San Diego Japanese Americans, were forcibly removed from their homes and lives in San Diego during the war and incarcerated at in Poston, Arizona. And before we really launch today's program, it's important that I take a moment to acknowledge Tuesday's passing of one of our community's most important friends and leaders, Norman Mineta. I hope that you've seen many of the tributes to him in major media, but in a nutshell, Secretary Mineta was a Secretary of Transportation on George Bush's cabinet. He was a US Congressman for 20 years, and more locally, he was the chairman of the board of the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. And for the JA community, Mr. Mineta was the staunchest advocate for redress in the 1980s and for further reparations in the 1990s. And he was a good friend to us all. His personality, his warmth, but he came to Los Angeles a lot because of the museum and because of the community with which he had very close ties in Los Angeles. And I do want to say that very memorably, after September 11th, the World Trade Center devastation, he was Secretary of Transportation and not only handled all the important transportation issues, but upheld protections for Muslim Americans. I believe his own wartime incarceration at the age of 10 as a boy influenced his life's work. And so it's a huge loss for us and really for all Americans. So I take a moment to thank you, Norman Mineta, and now may you rest in peace. Today's program is a kickoff for May's Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Here we are. The wartime removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans was and remains one of the greatest abrogations of constitutional and human rights in US history. Also, it caused tremendous personal, emotional, and financial trauma to this community. It's an impact that has lasted for generations. But to share their knowledge and perspectives today are professors Matthew Estes and Susan Hasegawa. I want to mention Susan has included in her talk the testimonies of San Diegans Elsie Hashimoto, Francis L. Honda, and Harry Kawamoto, former carcerees and a veteran who shared their experiences and the impact of Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 at the 1981 Commission hearings. And a reminder at the end of today's program, we do have time for your questions and comments, so please stay with us for that. So our first speaker is Matthew Estes. He's a professor of history at Palomar College for 17 years. He has worked full-time in education at the K-12 and community college level for 27 years. Matt, you don't look that old. He shared, quote, "My interest in researching the history of the Nikkei community, especially the internment, began at age 9 working with my dad. I have authored and co-authored articles for the Japanese American community for the Journal of San Diego History, the Journal of California History, and Great Plains Studies. On a personal note, my mother and her immediate family were evacuated during World War II, and her extended family was interned at Manzanar," unquote. And Matthew, although I didn't have the privilege of knowing your father, Don Estes, his work and contributions to the history of Japanese Americans in San Diego is very, very well known. and they comprise a huge, a valuable part of our Historical Society collection. So let me just take a moment to thank you again for your dad's contributions and your contribution today. Susan Hasegawa is a professor at San Diego City College, and she teaches US history and Asian American history. She's also the past chairperson of the History and Political Science departments, and she has researched and written on the Japanese experience in San Diego for the past 20 years and has curated a number of exhibits locally. And based on oral history interviews and archival photographs, her community history entitled Japanese Americans in San Diego was published in 2008. In 2021, Susan co-curated a wonderful exhibit, Call to Serve, Clara E. Breed and the Japanese American Incarceration for the San Diego Public Library. She's also written articles for numerous publications for the Japanese American National Museum. She has consulted on many projects concerning the JA experience for Oxford Publishing, University Press of Colorado, the Old Globe Theater. She grew up in Hana, a small town in East Maui, but she has called San Diego home since moving here for graduate school in 1989. And I do want to just add, Susan has been the historian for the Historical Society for many years and has been an expert presenter on our behalf and on behalf of the community. So thank you for that, Susan. After their presentations, I'll speak briefly about reparations, the actual, how did my parents, your parents, our relatives receive the apology and receive the monetary compensation. Okay, and now we'll begin. Welcome, Professor Matthew Estes.
Thank you. What I would like to do for this part of the presentation is give you the historical background to the evacuation and the internment. And I'm going to do this by using primary historical sources, both those from people who are interned, also from the government's point of view. Now, as far as the government's point of view and what they were telling the American people at the time was going on, we are going to use a newsreel that was put out in 1943. And the narrator of the newsreel is Milton Eisenhower, the first head of the War Relocation Authority. That was the civilian agency that was charged with overseeing both evacuation and the internment. Now, I know many of you are wondering, wait, Eisenhower? Yes, he is Dwight's younger brother. Anyway, let's talk about a little bit of historical background to the internment itself. These are 120,000 people we're talking about, the overwhelming majority of whom are American citizens. So how do you justify this? Well, one way you do this is you make the people you intern the other, people who are not like you. And California has a long history of anti-Asian policy and anti-Asian racism. This starts with the Chinese when they start coming here in the 1850s and 1860s, and I could go on and on about all the specific anti-Chinese policies that California and the federal government enact. But the big one for us is the issue of citizenship at the level of the federal government with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. What this said was all members of the, quote, Mongolian race, that is the old scientific term for anybody who's Asian, they are now aliens who are ineligible for citizenship, meaning if you are an Asian of any kind who immigrates to the United States, you cannot become a citizen. Now, when it comes to how things work in California, one of the reasons that California does not have the same history of racial segregation and systemic racism like we see in the Jim Crow South is Californians are smarter racists than Southerners. In California, aside from foreign nationals, anytime we're dealing with American citizens, racial discrimination was carried out through unofficial agreements. So when the schools segregated, it was not because of state law. It was because of school board policies. And sometimes it didn't even go as far as policies. It was just kind of understood that these schools were for one type of student and other schools were for other types of students. Restaurant and theater owners did the same thing. They all agreed, either amongst themselves privately or in some cases organizations that were part of the Theater Owners Organization of California, they decided they would segregate their audiences and patrons by ethnicity. But again, it's not the state being an actor, so it doesn't have the same kind of historical precedence and power that, say, Jim Crow does, and therefore it's not remembered. Now, when it comes to purely private things, here's just one example. A restrictive housing covenant, an addendum to a bill of sale for a piece of property, in particular a residential home, that said that if you or your heirs ever sold this piece of property, you would not sell it to, well, whichever group you wanted to exclude, whether that's African American or Latino or Asian or Jewish or whatever. And again, this is a protected right of property until 1948, and then again until the 1960s with the Fair Housing Act. Now, that's an official bill of sale. You've also got First Amendment protections. I'm sure many of you have seen this photograph. This is something that many people see online, and it is often erroneously connected to the internment. It is sort of connected to the internment, but more in the lead up than the actual internment itself, because you look at the date. This is 1923, and what this photograph does not show are all the houses on either side of this woman that have similar signs. So obviously, if you are any kind of an Asian family looking to buy a house, if you drive through this neighborhood, you're probably going to keep driving. So it's a very short jump to go from this to say these people are outsiders to making it a, quote, scientific fact. Here's a little gem from Life magazine following Pearl Harbor, where they try to help the American people tell Asians apart. And if you look at this and you're wondering, wow, this looks mighty familiar, who else do I know at a history from this particular time did this sort of like racial measurement? Yes, it's the Nazis. The answer is the Nazis. Now, how did this affect people? Well, my father did an interview with Dr. Roy Tanaka in 1979. He was a doctor here in San Diego. Anyway, in January of 1942, during a blackout, that is to say, there was the San Diego military defense district had thought there might be a Japanese air raid, so everybody was ordered to turn off their lights and pull their blackout shades. Anyway, he got a call from one of his Issei patients whose wife was having a miscarriage, and the man was so panicked he couldn't speak English. He only could speak Japanese. So Dr. Tanaka answered him in Japanese and calmed him down, and eventually was able to go and help him out. The next morning, the FBI shows up at Dr. Tanaka's office. They haul him downtown, where the senior agent in charge grills him for hours about speaking Japanese on the phone during the blackout. So obviously they were tapping his phone. And after a couple of hours of this sort of interrogation, Dr. Tanaka asserted his rights as an American citizen, saying that, I was born in this country, and I'm one of the doctors who certifies men to be in the service. I'm an American citizen. I have rights. This is perhaps the most chilling part of the interview. He said, when I said this, the answer he got was, if I were you, I wouldn't use your rights as an American citizen just now. And obviously that stayed with Dr. Tanaka. It's pretty terrifying. Now, on the federal level, by February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order number 9066. Now, this has been called by multiple historians the most unprecedented delegation of presidential authority to a subordinate in American history. And the only kind of advice that Roosevelt gave to Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, to whom this power was given, was be as reasonable as you can about all this, Henry. So under this, what the military was able to do was take pretty much unchecked authority. What they ended up doing was designating parts of the entire West Coast both restricted and prohibited zones, and they had full authority about who could be in those zones and who they could remove from those zones, and who they could basically remove from those zones and hold indefinitely. Now, one of the really scary things about Executive Order 9066 is it never mentions either the Japanese or Japanese Americans. That's kind of terrifying, because in many ways, this actually makes Executive Order number 9066 even more dangerous. Because if it had mentioned the Japanese, at least it would set the historical precedent that if you go after a group, you must at least define that group. But they didn't. So what this means is this can now be used against anybody. And it was, but primarily it was used against the Nikkei, the Japanese and the Japanese American. Now, what I want to do is just have Milton Eisenhower explain how this whole process really began.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our West Coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move. This picture tells how the mass migration was accomplished. Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved. Then the coastal areas should move inland. Immediately, the Army began mapping evacuation areas and for a time encouraged the Japanese to leave voluntarily. But trouble for the voluntary evacuees soon threatened in their new locations. So the program was quickly put on a planned and protected basis. Thereafter, the American citizen Japanese and Japanese aliens made their plans in accordance with Army orders. Notices were posted. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register.
So, as Eisenhower mentioned in the whole registration portion of the video, that these notices for the Nikkei to come and to register and then show up for evacuation were just put up all over. And you notice he says, American Japanese and their alien parents. Yet here's what it actually says in the civilian exclusion order. I use number 4 in class because that's the one for San Diego, but there were these were issued for all of California. But it says it is hereby ordered that all persons of Japanese ancestry, including aliens and non-aliens, and then it goes on to discuss both registration and showing up for evacuation. That's a somewhat troubling use of the English language. We all know what an alien is, I suppose. That means a foreign national. So what then is a non-alien? I mean, I guess supposedly it's an American citizen, but they never said that. So that gives a very disturbing kind of insight into how the government viewed even Japanese Americans, people who had been born in this country. Well, since these notices were put up all over, just in public in California, sure, the Nikkei knew that they were going to be evacuated in 7 days, but so did everybody else. So what do you do with all of your stuff? Well, you have to sell it. There were these panic evacuation sales. And of course, since everybody knew the Nikkei were being shipped off, they were offered pennies on the dollar for any of their household goods, anything they wanted to sell, any of their inventory from their stores. And of course, farmers, it's not like you can take your crop or your tractor with you, so they were offered a pittance. And if people really, really wanted to be cheap, they could always just wait until the Nikkei were evacuated and then loot the place. Now, the Nikkei community in downtown San Diego did try to save what they could as far as people's durable household goods. They went to the Buddhist temple and used the temple itself as a storage area, and they basically stacked all of their furniture and china, artwork, musical instruments, things that they obviously could not take with them when they reported for evacuation, but they stacked them up in the temple and hoped for the best. Well, we can all see what happens. In January of 1943, there was a break-in at the temple. Somebody backed in a car, or a truck actually, broke in, unloaded as much stuff as they could, and then firebombed the building to hide the fact that there had been a robbery. So everything that had been stored there was lost. Now, let's take a look at what Eisenhower says about the evacuation itself, and we'll contrast that with some experiences and photographs of the internees.
Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort. In small towns as well as large, up and down the coast, the moving continued.
What I'd like to do is continue showing you kind of the difference between what the government was telling the people about what was happening to the Japanese Americans and what actually happened. So this is a government photograph that was taken that was meant for public distribution. We know this because there's no military personnel in it, and the windows of the bus are uncovered. When the internees talked about what the experience was like in evacuation, everybody, every single person said that either the bus or the train they were in had the windows covered. Either they were covered with paper that was taped down, or that the window shades on the trains were locked down. Now, here is a photograph taken by the government about evacuation that was not meant for public distribution. We know this because there is not just a uniformed soldier in this. The soldier is armed. I mean, the guy has a fixed bayonet to his rifle. Now, you will notice, for those of you who've watched the video closely, or if you wish to look it up online after this presentation, the government went to great lengths to downplay the military nature of the internment. Now, the first phase of the internment really was being shipped off to what they call assembly centers. I'm going to show the clip about where Milton Eisenhower discusses these. This was the first phase of the internment. Most of these were in areas that were relatively close to where the Nikkei communities originally lived. And this is where they were shipped before they were sent on to the second phase of the permanent concentration camps.
Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all. The residents of the new community set about developing a way of life as nearly normal as possible. They held church services, Protestant, Catholic, and Buddhist. They issued their own newspaper, organized nursery schools, and some made camouflage nets for the United States Army.
Once the internees arrived at Santa Anita, and this is something they didn't show in the film, obviously, their luggage was searched, and many of the items that they were told to either bring or told they were allowed to bring were confiscated by the government, and of course, no receipts or recompensation was ever given. They were forced into an institutionalized style of living. They had 6 mess halls at Santa Anita, but even with 6 mess halls, there was not enough space to feed everybody at one sitting, so you had to eat in shifts, and so you would be assigned to a mess hall and a shift. So like the red mess hall, shift 1 for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And, for example, breakfast shift 1 would be 6 to 7, shift 2 would be 7 to 8, 8 to 9 would be the third shift, and things like that. As far as housing, people either ended up in a tar paper barrack where they just tossed up literally a 2x4 frame with tar paper and a couple of 40-watt bulbs, or you went in a horse barracks. And I'll let Roy Matsumoto describe what it was like to live in one of these converted horse stalls.
The conditions are bad because they put them in a horse stall because on account of I'm the butcher. So everybody butcher stuck in where the horse slept. And then horse manure on the ground and piss all over on the wall. And they whitewash, but it still smells, And I had to pick up these hay for it, making the mattress, then picking up these straws. And they were more miserable, and it made me more mad, But instead of, I figured that way, a lot of people worse than me, because I lost, tractors and truck and farm equipment, everything. But I didn't have much. The only thing I lost was the bank, saving, and not much.
Oh, by the way, while it was relatively easy to put in electricity, you just run basically a giant extension cord to the barracks, putting in plumbing was a different issue altogether, and the plumbing facilities were really pretty primitive. And of course, on top of all of this is the stress of being surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. If you look at the photograph on the left there, yes, that is a machine gun. That is a belt-fed machine gun. So an incredibly stressful and militarized time. Now, it was possible to have visitors come and see you at Santa Anita. I have a photograph here of the visitor center. It is literally just a designated section of outer fence line with a couple of barriers to prevent both the visitors and the internees from getting too close. I have up there a quote from the announcement that says that the visitor center at Santa Anita is now open, and the internees can receive, people to come and visit them. However, for the present, the internees may only meet with blood relatives. Yes, you can think about that as long as you like, but that's the mindset of the government, this kind of weird hurry-up military necessity and lack of common sense. Now, this was the first phase of the internment. The second phase of the internment, as I'll let Eisenhower describe in just a second, are the permanent relocation camps, or to be more fair, they're called concentration camps. And I don't have a problem using that term because while the War Relocation Authority may use the term relocation camp or relocation center, the military used the term concentration camp. And there were 10 of them scattered mostly throughout kind of the middle and eastern United States. So I'll let Eisenhower give the government's point of view.
Meanwhile, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere, quarters were being built where they would have an opportunity to work and more space in which to live. When word came that these new homes were ready, the final movement began. At each relocation center, evacuees were met by an advance contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity. Here they would build schools, educate their children, reclaim the desert.
Now, he does kind of play down the primitiveness of all of the the internment camps. What I have here for you is a photograph of the barracks at Poston in the fall of 1942. We can tell it's from the fall because, one, everybody's bundled up. It's starting to get cold. If anybody knows anything about the desert, it can get very, very cold. And we compare the photograph with the diagram done by Tetsuya Saki in 1943 in a letter to Clara Breed, where he shows how, in order to beat the heat, the internees had put a second roof on their barracks. They had kind of raided the lumber pile and and done their best to put a second roof on their barracks so it would kind of block some of the sun. And I have a quick interview from Rodi Tokiwa, who's from Salinas, and he's going to talk about what it was like to show up at Poston and the heat and the weather, what it's like, especially for someone from Central or Southern California.
I went to Poston, Arizona. And Salinas is a cool place. When the weather hit 80 degrees, we were burning up already. And the day we got to Parker, Arizona, 114 degrees. And later on, as I thought about all this that happened the day we got there, people were fainting like flies because none of us prepared for any of this. And you think they'd come out and give us salt pills? We weren't even talked to about using salt. And if it wasn't for the fact that some of the people that got there earlier than us found out that you got to take a lot of salt because you sweat like hell. And all you got is a barrack, and it's hot as hell in them barracks, So we were very fortunate because of the fact our train was the last one to leave Salinas. Well, by the time we got to Poston, half the people already settled in, so they come out to meet us when we got there on the bus. And they were the ones that gave us salt pills and told us you got to take a lot of salt because, we don't know nothing about those things. So they said, yeah, we found out you got to take a lot of salt because when you sweat so much, you got to have salt. And I'll never forget because we got over there and we were dropped off, and then they took us to our barracks. And the first thing they said when they dropped us off at the barracks, There's the baled hay. There's a mattress cover in the barracks for each one of the beds. Fill it up with hay, that's your mattress. Well, hell, you never used a mattress. It was too damn hot. And we used to sleep outside. And you know, we're dumb, see, because we don't know nothing about scorpions and stuff like that. And finally, one guy hollers, "Hey, look at all this damn thing crawling around under our beds." And they were scorpions, see, because of body heat. And the scorpion liked heat. So we found out there were scorpions. You'd be liable to die if they sting you, you know?
So in it, Eisenhower makes the the statement that we're doing this as a democracy and a Christian nation should, and this is one of those times you really want to measure the United States based on, okay, what did we do versus what are our national ideals? Is this something we should have done? Now, of course, something like the internment produced some very important Supreme Court cases dealing with government power and individual liberty. The first of these was, actually two of them, was Hirabayashi versus the United States and Yasui versus the United States, where separately two young Nisei lawyers challenged the legality of the military curfew in the restricted zone, saying that if you're Nikkei, if you're of Japanese descent, you can't be out of your house beyond a certain time. And, of course, the exclusion of the Nikkei from certain areas on the West Coast completely. Well, in these two Supreme Court cases, they upheld both the legality of the curfew and the exclusion of the Nikkei from the West Coast. Now, in a later case in 1944, we have Korematsu versus the United States. This one's really important and very scary because in this case, the entire legality and constitutionality of the internment itself was challenged. And in Korematsu, the court upheld both the evacuation and the internment as a constitutional use of the government's power. Now, there was one slight victory I feel like I have to mention, and that would be Ex parte Endo. That was decided the same year as Korematsu. Now, in it, a young Nisei woman, Mitsui Endo, had sued the U.S. government, saying that she was a loyal American citizen who had not been convicted of a crime. Why was she in a concentration camp? In this case, the court ruled in favor of Mitsui Endo, where they said loyal individuals could not be detained without due process, and they ordered her release on a writ of habeas corpus. However, the way it's written is basically each individual would have to go and prove their loyalty in court, one at a time, basically. And again, the constitutionality of the internment is still upheld. One of the really scary things about the internment, beyond what I've already talked about, is the fact that the government covered evidence up about knowing that many of the claims, like all of the claims basically, against the Japanese Americans were false. Because there was a memo written in 1944 as the government was preparing to argue the Korematsu case before the Supreme Court. It was sent by Edward Ennis, one of the Assistant Attorney Generals of the United States, to Charles Fahey, who was the Solicitor General of the United States. The Solicitor General is the government's lawyer. They are the person who argues the government's case before the Supreme Court. In the memo, and I will read it to you, Ennis says, "The Department of Justice has an ethical obligation to the Supreme Court to refrain from citing General DeWitt's claim if the department knows that important statements in that the report are untrue. The general tenor of DeWitt's report is not only to the effect that there was reason to be apprehensive, but also that overt acts of treason were being committed. Since this is not so, it is highly unfair to this racial minority that these lies go uncorrected. This is the only opportunity which this department has to correct them." So in other words, this is the smoking gun. This is proof that the government knew that the Nikkei were loyal, that the military were lying about the issue of disloyalty, and specifically in the Korematsu case, they took part in suppression of evidence. And of course, Fred Korematsu was convicted. Now, when this memo was brought to life by Dr. Peter Irons of UCSD in the 1980s, that brought about what is known as a coram nobis hearing, where basically Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minoru Yasui were all exonerated. Their convictions were vacated from the war. Here's the problem, though. This, again, deals only with those three individuals. It does not touch the constitutionality of the internment. The internment is still seen as a constitutional use of the government's wartime power. You would hope that, okay, this is the end of it. We'll have no more of this kind of nonsense. We've learned our lesson from history. Unfortunately, no. In 2018, we had the Supreme Court case of Trump versus Hawaii. Now, this was a challenge to President Trump's Executive Order 13769. This was the so-called travel ban for people from Muslim countries, and the state of Hawaii would not enforce it. Again, it would not, enforce this order that would not allow people from certain, kind of blacklisted countries in. Now, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in favor of the travel ban. Now, what does this have to do with the Japanese American internment? Well, let's take a look first at the dissent written by Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She says, the court redeploys the same dangerous logic underlying Korematsu versus the United States and merely replaces one gravely wrong decision with another. Now, in response to this, Chief Justice John Roberts issued the majority opinion, which again upheld President Trump's travel ban, but he did address Sotomayor's criticism. He says, the dissent's reference to Korematsu, however, affords this court the opportunity to make express what is already obvious. Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided, has been overruled in the court of history, and, to be clear, has no place in law under the Constitution. Okay, so what does this mean? The Chief Justice of the United States, in the majority opinion, says that Korematsu was a bad decision. So does Trump v. Hawaii overturn Korematsu? Well, legal scholars disagree. Many of them say, no, it does not, because the issues in play in Trump versus Hawaii are different from the issues in Korematsu versus the United States. So whenever there's disagreement, no, it's not overturning. So what that means is Korematsu is still, quote, good law. Now, obviously, that does not mean good as in moral. What it means is the internment itself is still seen as a constitutional use of the government's wartime power. I would like to end by talking about a particular, kind of defense of the internment. People may say things like, oh, okay, it might have been wrong, but that's by today's standards. People back then, they all felt that way. I would say no, that there were plenty of people who knew this was wrong, and some were actually willing to say it. And the most famous of these statements of the internment's wrong comes from Justice Frank Murphy's dissent in Korematsu versus the United States. And I'd like to read it here as I close my presentation. I dissent, therefore, from this legalization of racism. Racial discrimination in any form and in any degree has no justifiable part whatever in our democratic way of life. It is unattractive in any setting, but is utterly revolting amongst a free people who have embraced the principles set forth in the Constitution of the United States. All residents of this nation are kin in some way by blood or culture to a foreign land, yet they are primarily and necessarily a part of the new and distinct civilization of the United States. They must, accordingly, be treated at all times as heirs of the American experiment and as entitled to all the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. I believe that ends your part of the presentation. And we'll move now to Susan.
Hello, my name is Susan Hasegawa, and I'm a professor of history at San Diego City College. My section is titled Starting All Over Again and Redress to Make Remedies or to Correct and Compensate. Once the government started closing camps, starting in 1945, detainees, incarcerees had to decide what to do. And Yoshiko Kikuchi wrote a poem, Should we go west to our old nest, or should we go east to explore new land? There may be a big storm tomorrow. For San Diegans, many of them wanted to come home to San Diego, but they were unsure about what type of reception they would get. San Diego had been transformed during the war to what one brochure said was a blitz boom. Hundreds of thousands of people were moving to San Diego because of the war industries, industries like airplane manufacturing, and there was a huge housing shortage. So the government said, we'll give you a one-way ticket to a place where you want to go and $25. Off you go. Some people like Sugimoto returned. He came back in January 1945, and he lived with a Caucasian family friend in North County. He wanted to graduate with his class, and he did. Others were more hesitant because farmers wanted laborers, but not necessarily farm competition. So farmers, Issei and Nisei farmers would have had a difficult time then reestablishing their farms. But families with men serving in the military got housing in then Midway, Rosecrans Sports Arena area, a place called Frontier Homes. During the war, San Diego had become defense city #1, and there was an awful lot of hostility to Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans. San Diego Chamber of Commerce passed a 1943 resolution saying, "Our vigorous opposition to release of any and all Japanese from internment camps, and that we also strenuously protest the coddling of these Japanese. Be it further resolved that the Board of Directors again go on record demanding legislation to forever prevent the return of Japanese, native and foreign-born, to the farmlands of California, and for their permanent disbarment from citizenship in the United States." So keep in mind, the Japanese immigrants and American citizens are others. They're foreigners. They're not real Americans. The city council went on to pass a resolution that said, by the council of the city of San Diego, having the right to appeal to the president and the Congress of the United States for protection against the danger involved in permitting the Japanese now concentrated in restricted areas to be released therefrom and returned to our midst, that the council does hereby protest against permitting any Japanese to return to this area. So it was definitely a hostile environment that San Diegans were returning to. But return they did nonetheless to rebuild their communities. And so in this storm, there were positive aspects. People restarted their farms or created new farms, like James Yamate and his Issei parents. Fishermen. Nisei fishermen went back into fishing. Issei and Nisei women got their jobs back at the fish canneries. And part of the positive aspects was then Oyama v. California, decided in 1948. It was a Supreme Court decision that struck down the alien land laws. The alien land laws were created then to prevent Issei farmers from owning land and being in the farm industry in the early 1900s. And the alien land law in part said aliens ineligible for citizenship could not own real property. And the state of California went after Issei farmers, even though they put the names in, not their own names, but their Nisei American citizen children's names. State still went after them, and Oyama then overturned it. With the Walter McCarran Act of 1952, Issei were no longer aliens ineligible for citizenship. They now could become naturalized U.S. citizens, and they did. Took the citizenship test, became U.S. citizens. Japanese Christian Church, Buddhist Temple San Diego, and Ocean View United Church of Christ all restarted their churches, and they were able to have then public picnics. The Buddhist temple then restarted their Obon festival, which is similar to Dios de las Muerte. And they, again, had kids. You had new Japanese American professionals, engineers moving into San Diego, and they started having children. So now as the children, or the Sansei generation, Sansei meaning children of Nisei, Nisei the second generation, they went to college, got involved in civil rights activism, were influenced by the civil rights movement, protested, and were very much activists in their communities. And the left-hand slide is then of the Third World Student Strike at what became San Francisco State University, which started then the first ethnic studies department. At the same time, in the 60s and then going into the 70s, former incarcerees, Nisei, are reconnecting with each other. And Poston Camp 3 reunion, which many San Diegans were incarcerated during the war, they started to have their reunions. And their Sansei children started asking the Nisei, what was camp all about? What happened? Now, into the 70s and 80s, there has always been a small group who was very vocal within the Japanese community about pushing for redress, saying we were wronged, we want justice. It was a huge injustice to put us in camp. And so redress, to make remedies or to correct and compensate, was a movement that came together in the late 70s into the 80s and involved then community organizations, Japanese American Citizens League, and then the newly created National Coalition for Redress and Reparations. JACL was lobbying at the federal level, and they were pushing for an apology and compensation. One of the main strategies was to create then a federal commission to study the wartime internment and incarceration. NCRR, or the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations, was a grassroots organization, and they were lobbying for reparations and an apology. They were recruiting people and getting former incarcerees into the hearings and sharing their stories and getting the community to talk about what happened during World War II. Another major point was representation in Congress. U.S. Senator Daniel Inouye, United States Senator Spark Matsunaga, U.S. Representative Norm Mineta, and U.S. Representative Robert Matsui. Unlike during the war, where there were no representation, no politicians that stood up for Japanese Americans or who were Japanese American, now there were members of Congress who lived through World War II. And if you note, then both Inouye and Matsunaga, they're in their Army military uniform. Both of them served with the 442nd 100th Regimental Combat Team, which was one of the most decorated units, military units in history for the duration and size of then the actual unit. Okay? Senator Daniel Inouye lost an arm. So now you also had the Norm Mineta, who was 10 years old when his parents, his whole family, was incarcerated at Hart Mountain. And if you notice in the picture, then he also has a family member who was served. Representative Robert Matsui was 6 years old, and he testified, how could I, as a 6-month-old child born in this country, be declared by my own government to be an enemy alien? How can my mother and father who were born in this country also be declared a potential enemy alien to their country? And so representation mattered because all 4 of them were part of advocating, lobbying for, and pushing for redress and eventually reparations. Congress created the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, and this is where the community came out. Okay, more than 500 former detainees spoke out, and they're fighting for justice. They're fighting to be heard, and they're fighting for some type of apology and acknowledgement that they were wronged. The San Diego stories that we will be sharing are from Elsie Hashimoto, Francis Honda, and Harry Kawamoto.
Shall we just start off with Elsie Hashimoto?
My name is Mrs. Elsie Hashimoto of San Diego. The events of Pearl Harbor immediately produced anxieties and fears among all the Japanese families. My husband was pastor of the San Fernando and Baldwin Park churches. Rumors were flying and newspapers headlined Japs, traitors, sabotage, and yellow peril. My husband and I felt it was safer for me to go to my parents, where my parents resided, before the curfew would make it impossible for me to travel. With the permission of authorities, my husband placed me on the bus at midnight so that I would be less visible to the American public. He joined me later after bidding our membership goodbye. There was another reason we had to abandon our church members. My father was seriously ill. While in Modesto, The final notice for evacuation came with a 4-day notice. All my parents' farm equipment, tools, animals, household furnishings, which included a piano, radio, washing machine, as well as automobile, were hastily sold for a total of approximately $100. We were taken to Merced Assembly Center by bus. Father was taken earlier by ambulance. My dad was denied the privilege of remaining outside in the hospital unless separated from his family. The facilities were totally inadequate for the critically ill. I believe he was the first person to pass away in our camps. It was a hot June day. He laid in agony on a straw-filled mattress which was placed on a canvas cot. He slowly passed away in this horse's stall. Though denied citizenship, my dad was a true American. All the years of sacrifice and hard work brought him little reward. He died behind barbed wires at the age of 49. Even the healthy had problems in this camp. The latrines were primitive. Many holes were cut out of pine boards for our seats. Waters gushed below. No partitions were provided for our privacy, and we had to sit on a long row. The timid suffered constipation. During my stay in Amachi, I suffered from malnutrition and difficult pregnancy. My first Christmas was spent in the hospital due to my weight loss to approximately 70 pounds. In closing, I'm willing to stick my neck out so that the public will be able to separate us from the Japanese that bombed Pearl Harbor. Total evacuation was not necessary. We were loyal Americans. The rejection and hardships created by this experience will remain forever in our hearts and minds. We did not face death chambers, but we lost our precious freedom without a trial. Part of us died in that desert camp. Sumi Kawamura sang the stirring song in the Merced Assembly Center ballpark. God bless America, land that I love. And with this as my affirmation, I close my testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll move right on to Francis L. Honda of San Diego.
Ready? Okay. I was living at Marino Orphanage for Japanese Children, 425 Southboy Avenue in Los Angeles. When I was made to wear a tag on my clothes and was given a tree to plant and water by my teacher, a Marino nun. As I was leaving, I noticed tears in her eyes and in the other and others that were there. We were put on a bus for what I thought was a short trip. I never expected to be put out in the desert like a dog in the middle of nowhere. I was 7 years old when I went to the concentration camp. They put me in the orphanage at Manzanar. The orphanage was made up of 3 barracks, 1 for boys, 1 for girls, and 1 was a mess hall. It was a very lonely place, and sad too, with babies crying, nothing to do. It was like the end of the world for me. The food was no good. I used to vomit and get diarrhea for weeks. My gums swelled up like marbles, and I lost all my teeth from pyorrhea. I fell off the barrack porch and broke my wrists, which never healed properly. I'm afraid to use it to this day to carry anything heavy. A baseball hit me in the throat, and I could not speak, and did not receive any medication. Even today, I can't speak without becoming tired. At that time, I could only lie down. I thought I would never speak again. In the winter of 1943, as I contracted pneumonia, I was dying. No priest came to see me, so I could confess my sins. I received no communion there in the hospital. When I got out of the hospital, I could not walk well, nor could I run. I remember the snow on the ground, and that from this time on, I could not memorize anything important like the times tables. To this day, I can't memorize numbers well. I have always had jobs that paid a minimum wage. I will never have a good job because of my past sufferings at the Manzanar concentration camp. I went from being a good student at Marino St. Francis Xavier School and Church to a mediocre American citizen for the rest of my life.
All right, we'll move right along to Mr. Harry Kawamoto, also of San Diego.
Mr. Chairman and honorable members of the Commission, I wish to testify of incidents which occurred during the evacuation years but are not known to most people. I was drafted into the military service February 1st, 1942, and so I did not go through the evacuation experience. When I became eligible for furlough, I requested one to visit my parents at Poston, Arizona. I was told that all persons of Japanese ancestry were not allowed in that area, and so denied. A fellow Nisei serviceman, Albert Ito by name, lost a brother in the alleged riot at Manzanar. When he requested an emergency furlough to attend his brother's funeral, he was denied for the same feeble reason. In 1943, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a visit to Fort Riley, Kansas. During his visit, Nisei servicemen stationed there were put into a barracks building and kept there under armed guard. As fate would have it, another group of Nisei servicemen at Fort Riley, overlooked by persons in charge of this ridiculous security measure, roamed about at will. The U.S. government did not trust the Japanese servicemen at that time. Witness the segregated non-combatant units to which we were assigned. I feel that since it was a decision of the government to induct the Nisei into military service, they should have been accorded fair and impartial treatment. To not allow a serviceman to attend his own brother's funeral can never be justified in my eyes. No apologies can erase or rectify these injustices, so I urge this commission to recommend redress and reparation in the greatest degree possible. Everyone of Japanese ancestry, and even others, incurred financial and psychological losses as a result of the government's actions, and therefore should be compensated for those losses as recommended by the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations. Thank you very much.
So you had then all this research into what happened, what was the impact. You had then personal stories of what was the personal impact to people's families and what happened to them during World War II. And the commission produced Personal Justice Denied, which said there was no military necessity. Furthermore, the causes for incarceration, internment, forced evacuation was race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And the commission called on Congress to pass a public apology and redress of $20,000 to each survivor of incarceration during World War II. And so the next step was the fight to get redress and also then reparations passed. And that finally happened in 1988 with H.R. 442, which had a U.S. official government apology and $20,000. Now, what we can learn from this whole episode is that a small group of people can organize and fight for justice. And this is then part of the Japanese American story. And so, starting with the Bush administration, former incarcerees then started getting letters. And this is one of the letters that they did.
Thank you very much to Susan and Matthew. Even from the chat, people have learned, I have learned so much. And I'd like to take the last few minutes to talk about how after the Civil Liberties Act passed in 1988, many people felt like redress was done. Well, there was a big effort, another campaign to fight to get the actual apology and reparations check to the actual survivors. And I was fortunate, I mentioned earlier that I had lived in LA, and that's where I got involved with the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations. That was our name back in the 80s. And I was witness to those testimonies in 1981. That was huge. And that got me fired up for this next extended decades fight. So how does the government do this? The CLA directed the Department of Justice to identify the victims and distribute, the compensation. So they formed an ORA, Office of Redress Administration. And at the ORA, they were tasked to identify and verify and then compensate the survivors. They estimated that there would be 60,000 people, all their actuarials, and that's what they figured out. So this started in '88 after the law was passed. But then a couple of key points. There was no money attached to the bill. How do you pay people if there's no money? So there was another flurry of protests and activity and a campaign. But then Senator Inoue, and so Susan, your presentation about representation in Congress was so important because he got the appropriations and had it made an entitlement. That means we would not have to go back. The money was secured. We wouldn't have to go back begging for money every year to finish the payments. Then through the ORA, they had the good fortune of hiring someone who actually volunteered to apply for the job of director. He had, although a Caucasian American, he had a second cousin who was Japanese American and had experienced the camps. He had sort of an inside, information about this. So he was selected, Robert K. Bratt, and he was so smart. He was such a good person. He hired the best team of staffers, and together they really cobbled together an excellent program. The key parts of the program were, number one, they worked with the community very, very closely, especially the NCRR and JACL. They had to use the local vernaculars, the Rakushimpo, the Pacific Citizen, the Kashu Mainichi, and the Nichibei. All of the different vernaculars across the country were used for, disseminating all the information. A simple form was created in translation also, and the form had to be filled out by those who were applying, survivors of the camp, and sent in and processed. The very first checks went out in 1990 of October. They had a beautiful ceremony in Washington, D.C., and the people that the ORA had come to know and worked with were invited. So I was fortunately invited with, lots of people, NCRR folks, JACL folks, 442 people. It was a wonderful presentation, but what was the most really amazing was to see the 10 eldest JA survivors who were able to make it to DC on that stage. Most were in wheelchairs, and these really were our most senior elders. And to see them, witness them receive the check was one of the greatest moments of my life. I want to just say that we ran into some bumps after that. In 91, 92, we got lots of calls and letters from people who said that they got a rejection letter, a denial. We call this group of people the denials because the ORA could not pay them, is what they said, because they didn't qualify under the law, under the CLA. We fielded many calls and made files and organized them. We found out there were about 12 different categories of people being rejected. I'm going to just share one today, and that would be the largest grouping as far as that we knew of then, which were the Japanese Latin Americans. And an aside, through this 1990s decade, we learned a lot more about our history and what the impact of EO 9066 really was. I did not know that the US government went across international borders and abducted Japanese and other countries. So approximately, well, I believe it was 2,264 Japanese Latin Americans were kidnapped, were shipped up to New Orleans, which was the port of entry, were taken to Crystal City, Texas, an INS camp where there were other Japanese Americans as well as Italian Americans and German Americans, and they were kept there for the duration of the war. That's actually a misstatement. The Japanese Latin Americans had been stripped of all their papers, their passports, documentation. They had nowhere to go at war's end. And the government, neither Peru or Latin American countries really wanted them back. And the US government did little to help them. Some were able to return to their home countries. Some actually went to Japan, which, by the end of the war was just war devastated and, starvation. So many of them actually came back to the States. Many stayed in the United States for lack of anywhere to go. They persevered just like the JA community. And in the 90s, we got to know them. We got to know very, very well people whose first names were like Latin: Carmen Mochizuki, Alicia Nishimoto, Arturo Shibayama, and Hector Watanabe. Hector, by the way, is a friend in Los Angeles. His testimony is available on the visual communications website, which I know Samantha put into the chat. We learned about this group of people who had been, similarly harmed, and we fought for their rights. We took them in small groups to Washington, D.C. to appeal to the Department of Justice. That did not work. We filed with pro bono attorneys a lawsuit, Mochizuki versus Janet Reno, as it was in the day. And that was turned down. Finally, because it was Clinton in office at that time, in the late 90s, he brought justice-minded people to his cabinet and to the Department of Justice. They cobbled together a settlement. The settlement was only for $5,000 because the funds that had been, appropriated had been greatly diminished, because we were fortunate. Japanese Americans endured. With Japanese Americans were paid almost 83,000 letters of apology and the compensation, although minimum. And then approximately 645 Japanese Latin Americans received the settlement and letter of apology. The Japanese Latin Americans don't feel that it was equitable or necessarily fair to receive such a token amount. It was almost for many an insult, to receive so much less than Japanese Americans. So their struggle continues today, really to this day, and there is a campaign continuing. I need to try to wrap this up because we're past time, but I want to just finish by saying what was accomplished. Yes, what was accomplished by the CLA and the reparations was that it's huge that the US government apologized to an ethnic group of people. And they admitted their wrongdoing and they provided compensation. That sets precedent for other peoples in our country who are similarly, targeted or have been, really oppressed in our history. And hopefully this will serve, and has actually served some purpose, to establish a federal commission on behalf of the study of enslaved people, of slavery in the United States, and which is really at the forefront now. HR 40, and in California, AB 3121. These are current, efforts for commissions and compensation. I do want to say that it did accomplish our discovering our history. We learned a lot through the process of redress and reparations. And on the community level, we really were jubilant. We had a day of celebration. Fred Korematsu and his wife came down from San Francisco to Little Tokyo. I mean, it was a big celebration. And I think we felt vindicated that we were not the enemy, that we had done nothing wrong. We were not disloyal. And so for that, it was the beginning of some healing for some people and for our community. But let me just end by telling you what was not accomplished. Okay, 55,000 people who were Issei and older Nisei had died before the Civil Liberties Act was passed. That was one of the main criteria for payment. They received nothing. The DOJ and the ORA, because the ORA people were good-hearted, made sure that any family who wanted the apology was able to get it, but they did not receive any monetary compensation. In the community, we know that no apology, and many, many people are still very, very angry. No apology or modest reparations can bring back the lost freedoms, the humiliation of being shamed as being targeted as disloyal. These are the things that no amount of money could ever bring back. But I think that as we learn and as we hear these testimonies, as we hear speakers like Matthew and Susan, and we learn more about what happened to our communities, our families, I think it does help to further the healing process and kind of put things into a perspective where we can be once again, healthy and really come together as a very strong and vital community. Last comment. During times of war, the President of the United States has the full authority to do whatever he, she, or they wishes. That was Executive Order 9066. Also, we've seen it happen, throughout history. And we hope, as a civilized and humane people, that whoever is in that position will be just and humane. So with that said, we really are going to wrap this up, our portion, and just say, of course, we're going to have a Q&A, so I hope you can hang with us. And to, again, I repeat, a special heartfelt thanks to Susan Hasegawa, Matthew Estes. Your presentations are terrific. I invite collaborations, into the future together. And I want to thank all of our friends and family for attending. That's special and important. And to Cal Humanities, which I think Samantha will also shout out. So please, Samantha, take us over.
Thank you so much. We do have a few questions that came in. Some I transcribed over from the chat, so hopefully I didn't miss any, but if I did, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A so we can see them. We have one question from earlier on. I think it was answered a little bit in the Q&A, but maybe we can do so out loud too so everyone can hear. Gary says, I heard that Japanese immigrants in South America were forced to leave some of the countries and that when they tried to enter the US by boat, they were barred. Is this story true? Did this happen to Japanese Americans in Mexico as well?
And Susan, you responded in the chat. Would you like to take that?
Yes, I mean, as Kay mentioned, some 2,000 plus Latin American Japanese were deported. Okay, now I'm not sure of the boat, but there was a ship that was supposed to return persons of Japanese ancestry, and they were barred and they were barred from going back to Japan from certain ports and ended up a roundabout way going back through India route to Japan. And I'm not sure if that was the instance you were talking about, but it wasn't the United States that barred them. In fact, it was the United States that was requesting Peruvian Japanese, we want you, okay? And as so the Latin American Japanese that were deported, shipped to, incarcerated by the United States and their own governments, they were put in Crystal City, Texas. Did that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. And maybe if folks have follow-up questions, they can put them into the Q&A too, but I think that got at some of the basic information folks were looking for here. Thank you. We've got another question, and I think, again, it was answered in the chat a little bit, but can we talk about if San Diego ever formally retracted the 1943 resolution and make any apologies?
Yes. Actually, there were two very, very anti-Japanese resolutions during that time. One of them was rescinded, and I don't know the number right now, but I believe it was the one that Susan incorporated in her presentation. There is another one, Resolution 76068. I know that number because the San Diego Public Library, as an outcome of the Clara Breed exhibit, learned so much about the wartime incarceration of JAs, and they came across this resolution that was still on the books. They initiated a request to the San Diego City Council to have that one rescinded. Although that only occurred like in January, February, we have not gotten word yet about the progress. And I have been in email contact with the City Council President's office to ask about updates, and with the San Diego Public Library, and we've not heard it yet. But the moment we get it rescinded, we'll let you all know.
Thank you. And I did share the link to our program from February if you missed it. We are talking about topics related, and we do have a visit from one of our local elected officials. A couple more questions here. Why was there a conflict within the JA community about reparations of $20,000?
Would anyone like to take that?
Go ahead and take it, Kay, since you're at the forefront.
Well, I was at the side. I know that the conflict was, there were several. Number one, a lot of the elders, or many people, no matter what their age, didn't want to talk about it. Okay, they thought it's done. It brought up too many bad memories. They didn't want to revisit. So that was one of the internal community conflicts. And I believe, because of the commission hearings and inviting people to talk about it. You know, with NCRR, we had a lot of house meetings, community meetings, where we would actually carry a large television. We're talking about the 1980s here, and DVR players. And we would carry these pieces of equipment to homes and churches to show testimonies from the hearings. This broke open the floodgates for people to understand it's okay for us to talk about it. I have stories. This happened to our family. And I believe that it was really, really key to sparking the redress movement and keeping it going. It has kept me going to this day. When I saw Elsie, Francis, and Harry's today, it really, you know, it's just very emotional. And I've said this before, it's probably why I stay in this. Other conflicts were at a larger level, perhaps, between NCRR and JACL. You know, we had different approaches. And that, you know, books have been written about different approaches, but certainly Susan mentioned that the legislative direct approach was important. That was JACL's approach. They worked the Hill. JACL had a national office in Washington, DC. You know, for NCRR, we are grassroots. We're people in the cities, in the towns, writing letters, you know, sending telegrams, you know, faxing. This is back in the 1990s. You know, we didn't have social media. We didn't have, you know, all those different platforms. But so we worked in concert. We tried to keep our differences out of the public eye. We didn't want to show any division. That was one of our key kind of strategies, is you got to show unity. Because if you show disunity, that's more for the naysayers to target and, you know, and to diminish the campaign. So in the public eye, we kept a good front. We worked in LA closely with the Pacific Southwest District of JACL, Carol and John Saito. Oh my gosh, the best people in the world, and with the, you know, different JACL chapters. So that's all I've got to say.
Thank you, Kay. We have another question that came in on the chat, and it got answered a little bit, but I want to make sure we say it out loud too, so folks can all hear. We had a question: what about Japanese Canadians who were incarcerated during World War II? Did they receive redress and reparation?
Anybody particularly knowledgeable on this one? They did. Susan, did you have comments?
No, go ahead, because I know I can't remember the exact details, so go ahead.
Nor I. They were definitely removed from their homes, and they weren't put into like concentration camps. They were sent out to mining towns, and that were like, what is the right word? That were evacuated, that were left. And they, you know, were left, they just were sent away from, you know, certain areas. They had very harsh conditions, you know, also. They suffered mightily. But the Japanese Canadian government, the Canadian government compensated the Japanese Canadians, even I think before Japanese Americans got their compensation. And so I know that they were compensated, but a huge unfinished kind of, to me, matter that we don't talk too much would be the Aleuts and the Pribilof Islanders, Alaska and Pribilof Islands. They are included in personal justice denied. We actually had people testify who were from Alaska, but their devastation, if it's even possible, was worse than any other group of people, I think, during that time. And that'll be a talk for another day.
Thank you. One more question. Is Japanese, well, a couple questions in here. Is Japanese internment a part of K-12 curriculum? Why do you think so many Americans do not know this story? I heard that the play Allegiance didn't do so well on Broadway due to lack of audience understanding that it was a true story. Could this be true? It was a great play. So a couple things in there about K-12 curriculum and, you know, just general lack of knowledge and things like that. Anybody want to speak on those topics?
I'll talk about it. Allegiance was path-breaking and pioneering in that it brought the Japanese American story to the greater audience. And as Kay alluded to, that there was sometimes infighting within the community, Allegiance was also controversial within the community because it mixed real actual historical characters with fictional characters. And in bringing to light the Japanese American story, it also, the producers, directors, and writers wanted to create or wanted to have a different spin on it. Not the farewell to Manzanar victims versus the government, but sort of have a different spin on it. And I think in having that quote different spin and the mixture of both historical and fictionalized people, sometimes the main message got a little muddied. However, I do not want to detract away from, you know, George Takei's performance, Leah Salonga's performance, and how the community rallied around it to attend it. I went to both the Old Glow production and also in Broadway, on Broadway. I went to see it in New York City. And in both cases, Asian Americans came out to buy tickets. Asian Americans came out to see it. So I think that is also just another case study altogether from both within the community, within the Asian American community, and then also within the general population that I think would be interesting to study. So Allegiance, keep in mind, also was up against this musical called Hamilton. Came out the same year. And had Hamilton not come out, I think George Takei would definitely have had more awards and more recognition. But the fact that Hamilton sucked air out of everything, and I saw Hamilton too, and I was, wow. Okay, so it kind of, I would suggest Allegiance suffered from timing. Had it come out the year before or the year after, it would definitely have much higher visibility. So there are a number of factors that you know, affected the ticket sales of Hamilton, of Allegiance, I would suggest.
Yeah, and as far as the K-12 curriculum, I haven't taught K-12 in California in a long time, but once upon a time, there was a very small portion of the K-12 curriculum, the California history part, that where the internment was discussed. But to my knowledge, it's still a very tiny component. The bulk of California history is done in elementary school, I believe, still. And they don't, you know, they are finally starting to address the issue of the treatment of indigenous peoples in California. I think we may just have to work our way up the food chain because it's, you know, historically speaking, because we'd have to work with the experiences of the indigenous Americans, and especially how the Spanish, later Mexican and later American authorities treated them. And then, of course, in California specifically, we've got the long history of anti-Chinese racism, both official and unofficial, that is not dealt with at the lower levels. And we may, like I said, after we get to that, the internment may kind of get its own you know, section or unit. But it's part of this ongoing, you know, kind of effort. Again, I'm not involved with it anymore. I haven't been in years, but unfortunately, we're seeing that whole, you know, quote, anti-critical race theory nonsense going around. And fortunately, California doesn't have that kind of pushback. So I think if anybody wanted to organize it and try, they wouldn't face the same kind of political harassment you would, say, in Mississippi or Alabama or Texas. But again, I don't think it's been a priority here, at least not in my professional lifetime.
I can add to that a little bit. Yeah, it's a very, very small mention in the social science standards in California, as it is, you know, not even mentioned in other states. So I think we're sadly ahead of the curve in that case. And yeah, third and fourth grade curriculum is where it deals with state and local history, and it's very rarely brought up or mentioned. It's very educator specific, school specific. We have a lot of interactions with our local schools and with speakers that go out. I know Linda's in the room today, so she goes out to schools. And so we share, you know, our resources and our ability to share those stories within the San Diego community. We also have a new initiative beginning called Out of the Archives and Into the Classroom. That's grant funded by the JA Community Foundation. That's just getting started from JAHSSD. So we are hoping to reach all of those thousands of school children with primary source materials from our collections to help to tell that stories and bridge that gap. But it is very, very much up to the teachers and how much they want to dig into it and how much they want to bring to their students' attention. We've got one more question. I think it's our last one. What if the detainees / incarcerees had passed away? Would the family get the $20,000?
If they passed away before August 10th, 1988, no, they would not.
Oh, wow.
If they passed away on August 10th or August 11th, yes, they did. Some of the checks, the payments were divided to the immediate heirs of that person.
Wow. We've reached the end of our questions, and we have reached 11:30.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us today.